Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. This is a book summary of Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism, edited by Lawrence Reed. Myth number 1. Income inequality arises from market forces and requires government intervention. Summary response. Economic inequality, like the personality traits that make up each individual, are a defining characteristic of humanity. When economic inequality arises naturally in the marketplace, it largely reflects the ability of individuals to serve others. When it arises from political connections, it's unfair and corrupt. Allowing economic inequality to occur so long as it doesn't derive from politics inevitably raises the standard of living for society as a whole. Concern for the poor is often a way to simply disguise envy or disdain for the rich. Myth number 2. Because we're running out of resources, government must manage them. It is simplistic to assume that people will blindly use up what sustains them without regard to the incentive structures they face. If they have incentives to conserve, they will do so. Private property is a powerful incentive to conserve resources. You lose if you squander what's yours. When property is held in common, you have a license to use and abuse resources with little incentive to nurture and improve them. Myth number 3. Equality serves the common good. Response. If people are free, they will be different. That reflects their individuality and their contributions to others in the marketplace. It requires force to make them the same. Talents, industriousness, and savings are 3 of many reasons why we earn different incomes in a free society. Forcing people to be equal economically may make misguided egalitarians feel better, but it does real harm to real people. Myth number 4. The more complex the society, the more government control we need. Response. Complexity does not automatically suggest centralization of power. You and I have a full-time job managing our own respective lives. Our task increases exponentially if we try to control the lives of a handful of others, and it explodes beyond reason if we try to control the lives of millions. Myth number 5. Income inequality is the great economic and moral crisis of our time. Historically, the worst demagogues demonize a group they don't like, such as the rich, for the purposes of political gain and power lust. Hypocritically, many progressives advocate government income redistribution in the name of equality, but rarely run their own lives that way or spend their own money in accordance with the policies they support. Myth number 6. Capitalism fosters greed, and government policy must temper it. Summary response. Greed has become a slippery term that cries out for some objective meaning. It's used these days to describe lots of behaviors that somebody doesn't like for others, sometimes hidden reasons. Self-interest is healthy and natural. How you put it into action in your relationships with others is what keeps it healthy or gets it off track. Lawmakers and government are not immune to greed, and if anything, they magnify it into harmful outcomes. Myth number 7. The free market ignores the poor. Explaining how a socialized activity could actually be done better by private, voluntary means in a free market is a little like telling a blind man what it would be like to see, but that doesn't mean we should just give up and remain blind. Examples of the wonders of free and willing exchange are all around us. We take them for granted. Just imagine what it would be like if shoes and socks had been a government for a couple hundred years versus the variety and low cost of shoes as now provided in free countries by entrepreneurs. Free markets open the way for people to act immorally, but that doesn't mean they always will, nor should we assume that when armed with power, our behavior will suddenly become more moral. Number 8, the economy needs more planning, central planning, that is. Consider the wonders all around you. Perhaps far more than you ever imagined are the result not of some top-down central plan imposed by wise schemers in government, but rather of the dreams and plans of individuals and their personal initiative. Central planning, as an economic framework, is rooted in what Hayek would call a pretense to knowledge. No group of people, no matter how much government power they possess, can possibly know more than an infinitesimal fraction of the knowledge they would have to possess to plan an economy. Myth number 9, human rights are more important than property rights. Summary: you own yourself, and you own those material things you've created or traded for freely with others. These are rights to property in yourself and in your possessions, and cannot be separated from human rights. America's founders made no distinction between human rights and property rights for good reason. There aren't any. They are one and the same. Your right to what's yours is very different from a claim on the person or property of others. Myth number 10, I have a right. Summary: genuine rights are prior to government. They are part of your nature as an individual human. The desire to have something doesn't automatically mean you have the right to it. If your alleged right to something cannot be achieved without forcing another person to provide it to you, then it wasn't a right to begin with. You have a right to read a book, but you have no right to compel someone else to give you one. Myth number 11, rich people have an obligation to give back. Summary response: the innocent-sounding phrase, I want to give back, far too often implies guilt for having been productive or successful. If you earned it through wealth creation followed by free and voluntary exchange, don't let others get away with making you feel guilty just because you have it. The people who really should give it back are those to whom it doesn't belong, or who took it from others in the first place. Myth number 12, I prefer security to freedom. True security is an outgrowth of freedom, not an alternative to it. Being dependent instead of being independent is a move away from true security. Mr. Reed's observation more than half a century ago that increasing reliance on a welfare state for security would provide financial problems seems positively prescient today. Consider our $17.5 trillion national debt as evidence. The real choice is not between freedom and security, but between security and insecurity. Myth number 13, cooperation, not competition. Competition is actually a very important kind of cooperation. It prompts people to serve others in the best ways they know how. A company that gets a high market share because of its efficiency and service is both competitive and cooperative in the sense that it earns the satisfaction and patronage of customers. An economy without competition would be larded with waste and indifference. The core assumptions of antitrust laws are dubious and nebulous. Myth number 14, healthcare is a right. Claiming that one has a right to healthcare is rhetorical exercise. The rubber hits the road when it's actually enforced, which means somebody has to be compelled to provide it or pay for it. Centralizing healthcare decisions is a movement in the wrong direction, away from individual consumer and toward planners who have no special knowledge that would allow them to make good decisions for others. Market-based, consumer-focused options for healthcare deserve more serious consideration. Myth number 15, we are destroying the earth and government must do something. Physics teaches us that matter is not really destroyed, but rather transformed. So the ever-present question is it worth it? Market transactions transform resources as well as ownership of them. And if enhanced value doesn't result from those transactions, the resulting losses tend to minimize future mistakes. Myth number 16, ownership must be tempered by sharing. Progressives are two-faced when it comes to ownership. They are suspicious of it when it's private and personal, but supportive when it's politicized and centrally directed. Whether it's people or property, it will be owned. It's just a matter of whether it's owned by those to whom it belongs or to those who want to claim it for some alleged higher cause. Private ownership of property is both a virtue and a necessity. Get rid of it, and you flush civilization down with it. Common ownership is largely impractical and meaningless, even destructive. Myth number 17, all we need is the right people to run the government. As government grows, it creates more and more problems that are systemic and intractable. Profit management and bureaucratic management are two very different things. The former seeks to generate more value than cost, while the top priority of the latter is the promulgation and implementation of rules and regulations. The bigger government becomes, the more calls you hear endlessly for reform, which may suggest there's something inherently defective about the political system that prevents its practitioners from ever getting things right from the start. Running government like a business is a popular rhetorical point, but essentially an illusion that fails to recognize the deep differences between profit-driven business and rule-driven government. I would also add it doesn't differentiate from the voluntary sector and the coercive sector. Myth number 18, humanity can be best understood in a collective context. If you see the world as a collective lump of humanity, you'll likely come to very different conclusions about life and economics than if you see it as composed of billions of unique individuals. A snowstorm is only as big as its individual snowflakes are numerous. Abstractions are just that, while individuals are real. Take individuals out of the equation and you remove humans from humanity. Myth number 19, big government is a check on big business. Summary, big government and big business often play well together at the expense of startups, little guys, and consumers. Artificially, politically instigated barriers to entry make markets less competitive and dynamic, and establish firms more monopolistic. A free market, true capitalism, not its adulterated capitalism version, maximizes competition and therefore service to the consumer. Myth number 20, government can be a compassionate alternative to the harshness of the marketplace. Compassion isn't simply giving something away, especially if what you're giving away wasn't yours in the first place. True compassion means getting personally involved, instinctively. When we want to help others with our own time and resources, we overwhelmingly tend to do so through donations of time and money to private agencies, not public ones. The marketplace, where self-interest is a powerful motivator for the creation of wealth, is therefore the primary source for whatever wealth anybody has to give away. Myth number 21, capitalism's sweatshops and child labor cry out for government intervention. Sweatshops and child labor were commonplace in pre-industrial, pre-capitalist days because production and productivity were so low, not because people disliked their wives and children more than they do today. Savings, investment, and economic growth improve working and economic conditions faster and more assuredly than well-intentioned but misguided laws that simply close doors of opportunity. Myth number 22. Voluntary market arrangements use people. Summary, advocates of free markets have long been accused of supporting arrangements that use people. It's ironic because free markets are the one economic arrangement that most respects and empowers individuals. Markets, because they are rooted in the free choice of individuals, self-ownership, voluntary and contractual relationships, and customer satisfaction, are far less likely to use people in the pejorative sense than arrangements that are coerced, centrally planned, or bureaucratic. People should not be treated as objects of benevolence, but rather as sovereign individuals with whom we deal voluntarily, peacefully, and for the mutual benefit that occurs through freedom of choice. Myth number 23, the balance of trade deficit requires government action. Each of us as individuals have a balance of trade with other individuals, but none of us care about the numbers. What we care about are the goods and services we are trading for. Balance of trade figures count only merchandise. They leave out the huge chunk of world trade involving other things, from real estate to securities to services. No trades are deemed as anything but favorable by those engaged in the trading. So how can anyone add all those trades up and arrive at something unfavorable? Myth number 24, Americans squander their incomes on themselves while public needs are neglected. If the political class gets more to spend, that means that private individuals have exactly that much less to spend according to their own choices. Authoritarianism always argues for more of what belongs to others. Authoritarians never believe they have enough as long as anybody gets to make his own choices rather than having the state make those choices for him. Freedom means spending your own money the way you choose, even if you sometimes choose foolishly. And there's nothing about government that ensures that the people in it who spend other people's money will spend it more wisely than would those who earned it in the first place. Myth number 25, if government doesn't relieve distress, who will? Summary response, no one can name the names in advance of those who might come to the aid of fellow citizens in distress. The question is illogical. Without government assistance, a massive amount of private voluntary aid has poured forth from American citizens since the first settlement here. Is there any reason to suppose that politicians are more caring, compassionate, or effective in providing relief with other people's money than are the individuals who elect them in the first place and who get personally involved in the relief of citizens nearby? Government is not true charity, and it politicizes everything it touches. Myth number 26. Historical preservation won't happen unless the government takes charge. Summary. Why sell people and markets short when it comes to history? Examples are endless of private preservation and restoration. Private efforts have not just been a sideshow in historical preservation, they have been the centerpiece. By way of prices, markets send signals about what should be preserved and what should be discarded. Private ownership means somebody has a direct incentive to preserve. If government owns it, we all have incentives to use it and maybe even abuse something that is historically valuable. Government ownership means we have to trust bureaucrats to preserve what they don't personally own. Myth number 27, government must have the power to make people take better care of themselves. It's easy to fall into the trap of the quick fix that suggests the use of force to address a perceived problem. A thinking person will step back and consider the consequences of all of them, including the impact on individual rights. Private property rights, clearly stated and strictly enforced, provide a better framework for society's rules than the whims of people who want to dictate to others what's good for them. Delusion, paternalism, dependency, myopia, impatience, power lust, and self-absorption may prompt us to call the cops, but are hardly sound motivations for government policy. Myth number 28, government spending brings jobs and prosperity. Summary, the broken window fallacy essentially calls us to be thorough in our thinking. It's not enough to simply see the immediate or what strikes the eye. We must also consider the long-run effects of an act or policy on all people. When government spending seems to stimulate, it's because we're not seeing its redistributive nature. If government spends more, then there is precisely that much less spending done by those from whom the money is taken. If the government spends more and borrows to pay for it instead of raising taxes, then it's today's capital market that is smaller precisely to the extent government spending is bigger. Myth number 29, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle proved regulation was required. Summary, Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle is treated by progressives as though it were a documentary, but it was nothing of the kind. It was a work of fiction full fabrications. Even Teddy Roosevelt said the author was hysterical and untruthful. Sinclair was hired to write it for the purpose of advancing socialism in America. Government meat inspection existed before Sinclair's book ever was written. If even a portion of what he wrote really described what was happening routinely in meatpacking plants, either the government inspectors were complicit or else they were inexcusably ignorant, neither of which makes for a strong case for new regulation. In the end, the meat packers actually supported the Meat Inspection Act because it put the government seal of approval on their product and got the taxpayers to pay for it. Myth number 30. Capitalism's Industrial Revolution cursed the world with the horrors of child labor. Children worked before the Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution, in fact, which improved productivity so that eventually parents could earn enough to afford to leave their children at home. In Britain, the distinction between free labor children and parish apprentice children must be understood. The latter were under the care of often indifferent government officials, and the result can be hardly laid at the exclusive doorstep of capitalism. Myth number 31, labor unions raise wages and the standard of living. Wages can only be paid out of what is produced. No production, no wages. Therefore, greater productivity is the key to higher wages. Unions typically hamper production. Union activity may result in some people getting more, but without an increase in productivity, that simply means that some other people must get less. Either you bake a bigger pie for everyone, or you just slice the pie up differently. It looks sometimes like unions have actually forced wages higher because of the lower wages in non-unionized businesses. But the latter are caused in part by the outflow of labor from ununionized sectors to non-unionized ones. Unionized auto workers today, for example, may make a little more per hour than their non-unionized counterparts, but there are a lot fewer of them too. Myth number 33, FDR was elected in 1932 on a progressive platform to plan the economy. Franklin Roosevelt delivered a lot of central planning from Washington, but that wasn't what he asked voters to endorse him. That wasn't what he asked voters to endorse in the 1932 election. FDR attacked Hoover for greatly increasing taxes and spending, but once elected, did even more of both. FDR's close advisor, James Warburg, felt that FDR was economically illiterate and politically opportunistic. Myth number 33, the Great Depression was a calamity of unfettered capitalism. The Great Depression did not follow a period of unfettered capitalism. In fact, it was made inevitable by erratic monetary policy from the federal government, namely the Federal Reserve. After years of cheap money and low interest rates, the Fed set the stage for a correction with a policy of steep increases in interest rates and a deflation of the money supply. The Hoover administration took a recession and made it a depression by dramatically choking off world trade through higher tariffs and doubling the income tax. Franklin Roosevelt promised to undo Hoover's spending and tax increases, but after he was elected, he did just the opposite. The New Deal lengthened the Depression by preventing recovery. It cartelized industries, which raised costs and destroyed valuable crops and cattle. A depression within a depression occurred in 1937 after the imposition of costly new labor rules and higher taxes. Myth number 34, government must subsidize the arts. Government funding of the arts is not just music to the ears. It carries with it all the downside of dependence on politics. Claims that arts spending is magically multiplied are specious and usually self-serving and never look at alternative uses of the same money. Culture arises naturally and spontaneously among people who choose to interact with each other. Art is part of that, but it also competes with all sorts of other things people choose to do with their time and money. If art is truly important, then the last thing we should want to do is politicize it or divert it towards those things that people with power think we should see or hear. Myth number 35, Government is an inflation fighter. When you change the definition of inflation, you change the responsibility for it. Inflation is not rising prices. In fact, you have inflation first, and then, as a consequence, you get rising prices. Inflation, properly defined, involves an increase in the supply of money. Historically, the more control government exerts over money, the more likely the money will lose its value. The more that government spends and doesn't pay for with tax revenue, the more likely it will resort to the printing press. It's far more accurate to think of government as an inflation factory, not an inflation fighter. Myth number 36. Outsourcing is bad for the economy. Outsourcing occurs when people shop around for the best deals. We do it all the time as consumers. If it produces savings, then savings can be utilized for the purchase of other things. Outsourcing boosts productivity and living standards. Stopping it means compelling shoppers, in the case businesses, to settle for a more costly or less desirable option. Myth number 37. If FDR's New Deal didn't end the Great Depression, then World War II did. Wars aren't cures for depressions. They simply divert manpower and resources away from what consumers want to what government wants to win the conflict. FDR's New Deal prolonged the Depression and, fortunately, attempts to revive it to keep the economy going after World War II were squelched. The economy didn't collapse after World War II because reductions in federal spending and taxation encouraged entrepreneurship. Myth number 38, the minimum wage helps the poor. Billions of people who are utterly unaffected by the minimum wage because they are already earning something higher to begin with see their wages rise almost every year, some even during recessions. It's not a decree of Congress that does this. It's factors such as the productivity, capital investment, and competition in the labor market. You can't expect employers to pay workers more than their productivity is worth just because Congress demands it. At higher prices or wages, less is purchased. That's a law of economics more powerful than a minimum wage law from Congress. If raising the minimum wage to $10.10 makes sense, why not stop there? Why not declare that everyone must be paid $50 an hour? Myth number 39, free markets exploit women. Summary, the freer the market, the more opportunities there are for women, and anyone else for that matter, to progress up the economic ladder. Most of the 17.9% wage gap in the United States can be explained by a number of hours worked, marriage, and age. Women who work full-time and who have never married make 95.2% of male earnings, narrowing the gender wage gap to less than 5%. For those women who want to work many paid hours and invest highly in education, there are more income opportunities in the highest quintiles than there ever have been. Myth number 40, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Progressives should be honest and admit that the anti-free market policies they've promoted and achieved in the last half century have disadvantaged the poor and conferred favors upon the rich and politically well-connected. Amazingly, in spite of those policies, the poor overall are still better than they were 50 years ago. Imagine the progress that might have happened had those policies not been in place. Redistributing wealth is just slicing the pie differently at the risk of shrinking the pie. It's a static view of wealth, one that's greatly inferior to a view of baking a bigger pie for everyone. Myth number 41, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company proved we needed antitrust laws to fight market monopolies. If the Standard Oil Company was any kind of monopoly, it was not a coercive one because it did not derive its high and temporary market share from special government favors. There were lots of competitors to it here and abroad. If it was a monopoly, then it was of the efficiency variety, meaning that it earned a high market share because customers liked what it offered at attractive prices. The prices of standard products, chiefly kerosene, in the company's early history steadily fell. The quality steadily improved. Total production grew from year to year. This is not supposed to be the behavior of an evil monopolist who supposedly restricts output and raises prices. Accusation against standard, predatory price cutting, buying up competitors, conspiracy to restrict output and raise prices, securing railroad rebates, etc., sound plausible on the surface, but fall apart upon close inspection. Myth number 42, Jesus Christ was a progressive because he advocated income redistribution to help the poor. Free will, not coercion, is a central and consistent element in the teachings of Christ. It is not recorded anywhere that Christ called for the state to use its power to redistribute wealth. Christ endorsed things like choice, charity, generosity, kindness, personal responsibility, and voluntary association, things that are irreconcilable with coercively financed redistribution schemes. Myth number 43, the free market cannot provide public education. As long as government can tax its citizens and then provide educational services to them at a marginal price of zero, much private education will never come into being. Most parents would no more make educational decisions without consulting knowledgeable authorities than they would make medical decisions without consulting doctors. We don't use the small number of neglectful parents as a pretext for government controlling or finance of religion, nor should we use it as a pretext for government control or financing of schooling. Government domination of education assures that the entrepreneurial innovation and creativity we are accustomed to in, say, the computer industry will be missing from education. Myth number 44, Warren Buffett's federal tax rate is less than his secretary's. Warren Buffett created a new tax metric by combining individual income taxes and payroll taxes into one federal tax rate. He then asserted that his 2010 federal tax rate of 17.4% was 18.6 percentage points lower than the 36% average federal tax rate paid by his office workers. The 2010 Social Security and Medicare taxing mechanisms in place in 2010 were inherently fair. Ascribing a federal tax rate differential to employee-paid payroll taxes, as Buffett did, is analytically incorrect. This 7.65 percentage point federal tax rate differential is a mirage. I must disagree here. There is nothing inherently fair about one person or group violently taking property from another. Incredibly, Buffett included employer-paid matching payroll taxes into his calculations as well, thus doubling the 7.65 percentage point differential. Buffett ignored in his calculations roughly $1.6 billion in corporate income taxes borne by him in 2010 as a one-third owner of Berkshire Hathaway. He also ignored his share, roughly $400 million of Social Security and Medicare matching taxes paid by Berkshire Hathaway. The analytically correct comparison, excluding individual payroll taxes and including corporate income and payroll taxes, shows that Buffett's federal tax rate was actually over 10 percentage points higher than the average rate of his office workers in 2010. Myth number 45. Profit is evidence of suspicious behavior. Profit earned in a free and competitive market is the target of the misinformed and uninformed. It's evidence of value added, not value subtracted. Profit is a great motivator and incentivizer. As most economists see it, profit is composed of managerial remunerations, interest on capital invested, and entrepreneurial or economic profits. By itself, the sheer dollar amount of a firm's profit tells you nothing about profit as a portion of sales or as a return on capital invested. Myth number 46, robots and computerization cause unemployment. The use of robots to increase productivity while decreasing costs works basically the same way as past technological advances like the production line have worked. Those advances improved the quality of life of billions of people and created new forms of employment that were unimaginable at the time. Compared to humans, robots are cheaper to employ, partly for natural reasons and partly because government intervention. Natural costs include training, safety needs, overtime, and personal problems such as hiring, firing, and on-the-job theft. Unnatural, non-market costs stem from cronyism dispensed by governments. An increased use of robots will cause labor dislocation, which will be painful for many workers in the near term, but if market forces are allowed to function, the dislocation will be temporary. Myth number 47. Statistical disparities between races prove discrimination. There is no evidence from anywhere on Earth or any time in history which demonstrates that, but for discrimination, there would be proportional representation and absence of gross statistical disparities by race, sex, nationality, or any other human characteristic. Casual observation of ice hockey games suggests that blacks' attendance is by no means proportional to their numbers in the general population, but that's not evidence of discrimination. Myth number 48. The solution to overpopulation is population control. There is no relationship between high populations, disaster, and poverty. By a considerable measure, poverty in underdeveloped nations is directly attributed to their leaders heeding the advice of Western experts who champion repressive, redistributive, and anti-private property solutions. What are called overpopulation problems result from socialistic government practices that reduce the capacity of people to educate, clothe, house, and feed themselves. Myth number 49. Resource-poor countries need strong central planning to develop. Hong Kong, a small rock with little resources but still a lot of economic freedom, shows that freedom goes a long way to ensuring progress no matter how few your resources are. The biggest economic flops of the past century were both centrally planned and infatuated with numbers in spite of being resource-rich. Myth number 50. People love the Robin Hood story because he took from the rich to give to the poor. Generations have grown up with the heroic ideal of Robin Hood robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, but it was only in the 19th century that he amended his modus operandi to include giving to the poor. Market forces emerging with the breakdown of feudalism in the late Middle Ages made the lives of working people immeasurably better, and the nobles who lost their bidding wars for their services didn't like it. The targets of Robin Hood and his merry men were rich from plunder, not production. Myth number 51. Greedy capitalists take advantage of people in natural disasters. Price controls are the answers. Prices are not set arbitrarily. They are what they are for a variety of reasons. These reasons are summarized by two words: supply and demand. Government imposed prohibitions on price gouging mask the underlying reality, shielding people from the truth of it. Higher prices in the wake of reduced supplies result in conservation of what remains and the encouragement of new supplies, precisely what the situation calls for. Myth number 52. Progressives have good intentions, so what else is required? One thing progressives share with almost everyone else is a very high level of expectations for the private sector and a very low one for the public sector. Good intentions are by themselves nowhere near enough. Thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.